Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday, July 12th, 2024. I'm old, and so's Joe Biden, and what are you going to do about it, right? Okay, well, I'm not running for president, so it doesn't matter very much. But Joe Biden is. We'll be discussing that on today's program. Okay, that and many other things, of course. Yesterday was another big event, I guess. Well, I don't know. It was built up as a big event. It was an event. It was something that should have been covered by the press for normal reasons. Joe Biden concluding his work, I guess, at the NATO conference, having a big press availability. But it was, I guess inevitably built up into... Was it inevitable? Well, it didn't have to start down this road. But now that we're here, it was going to be inevitably featured as an event, another test event. Is Joe Biden... okay, is he fit to continue as the nominee for the Democratic Party for the, President of the United States? In case you hadn't noticed, it's an election year. And this, I don't know, I guess we could say this manufactured crisis, and it certainly seems that way, let's say at least artificially sustained crisis, I would think. But, from most reports, people saw what they saw during the debate. They were suitably alarmed, maybe a little bit more than suitably alarmed. But now every single sentence that he utters is a test of his mental acuity, which is, well, that part is completely unfair. It's ridiculous and particularly not very telling for somebody who has always battled the speech impediment that Biden has. But all right, everybody wants to be reassured, and I understand it. And the polling says things, and so now we have to look at what the polling says, although sometimes we don't look at all of what the polling says for various reasons. Sometimes there's a narrative that needs to survive, and sometimes there's something that contradicts that narrative, and you just can't... I don't know how to discuss it. We aren't prepared to discuss it. So don't worry about it. We have people. We have experts. We've had Greg Dworkin on, as usual, to parse the polls. And he remains worried, and legitimately so, but has explained an awful lot about the way the polling looks now, is likely to look in the future, why it's likely to look that way, what might be right with it, what might be wrong with it. And today we'll bring back Ian Reifowitz, who hasn't been with us for a while, but it's summertime. And that's Ian Reifowitz time. Just as Tuesdays are Joan days and Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Greg days, summer is an Ian Reifowitz thing. Because he's a professor at SUNY's, and in case you're not from around the East Coast part, SUNY, State University of New York. It's like I say it like everybody calls it SUNY, and they do and they should, but I don't know what people in Idaho think SUNY might be. The State University of New York system, but Empire State College? Do they call it that, or do they just say Empire College now? Well, I'll check in with him and we'll figure it out. Empire State College, I mean, it is the Empire State. That's true. So you'd think they would keep that anywhere. Ian is a professor there. In fact, a distinguished professor there. He's a distinguished professor wherever he goes. Even if you were on Gilligan's Island, there would be a distinguished professor and an equally distinguished, I'm sure, Mary Ann as well. So we'll give him a call in a few minutes, and I know he's anxious to give a take or two on this whole thing as well. Plus, as I understand it, he is on sabbatical and getting ready to write another book, and he's already got 3 under his belt. But you know how it is with professors. They can't wait to write more books because that's what they do. And also, by the way, it's apparently what the system demands of you. And maybe we can ask him a little bit about that as well. But before I give him a call and get him on the program, I need to acknowledge that the New York Times has finally produced what everybody's been waiting for them to produce. It's like a little late in coming, but finally producing the editorial board's decision that Donald Trump is unfit to lead, as they put it in their headline. And it's one of those graphic things that if you're reading it online, I don't know what it looks like in print, but maybe we can ask the distinguished professor from the State University of New York, who probably has a print copy lying around somewhere. One of those things where It's very graphic presentation. You have to scroll forever just to get through the headline and the rest of the message. But yes, they are at last acknowledging, yes, we've given Joe Biden a very hard time about his physical condition, but we might as well mention that even in top physical condition, Donald Trump is unfit to lead, and he's not in top physical condition. So lots to check in on. Why don't we get right to Ian Reifowitz here, because it's morning, and you know how professors are in the morning. They're ready to go. I don't know. Not all. If you have an 8 o'clock class, though, if you ever had an 8 o'clock class with one of these professors, then you know some of them can be morning people. All right. And through the magic of the internet, I am going to give him a Skype call. And, I'll have to discuss with the new editor whether we want to keep all the ringy-dingy noises in there or not. I think it's become endemic. Part of the show. Okay. Let's do it. Let's get started. And I love the little bloops and ringy-dingies that go along with it. And here we are. Good morning, Ian. How are you?
I'm doing well, David. How are you?
Well, that's less important, I think. But but thank you. I'm fine. It's been a while, and it's summertime. This is the time that they let you professors out of the cage, and you get to do some other things every once in a while, I guess. And I understand you are on sabbatical to start on a new book. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Today is the first day of this research sabbatical. It's very exciting. Although I do have to mention, I was listening to your lead-in, and it's very important. I believe I'm not sure if it's in the U.S. Constitution, but it's definitely in the federal statute that if you mention Mary Ann, you must also mention Ginger.
Okay. Well, I think she gets quite enough attention as it is, and I'm just glad they included her in the theme song, because the original theme song, they just left the professor and Mary Ann out entirely. So this is sort of...
It was "and the rest."
Yeah. Right. So this is sort of my own kind of affirmative action program for making up for that initial slight. But, I think they're both quite distinguished. I won't leave them out. And, Mrs. Howell was a nice person as well. Thank you. Okay. I appreciate
cultural references from our childhood. Have we done that now?
Yes, I think we're done with that. And I hope, though the fact that it's not on the air anymore, even in reruns, I don't think anywhere. I don't know, or maybe like TV Land channel. But the kids today might just barely know what Gilligan's Island really was anyway. But I hope so, because otherwise the first 5 minutes of the show is a waste. So, I understand you're working on a new book, but you do have a daily topic of the day. You too have been, I'm sure, watching with rapt attention at least the controversy that has erupted and the fanning of the flames about Joe Biden's physical health and mental acuity, I guess. Were you able to watch at all any of the television production of yesterday?
Oh, you don't want to just talk about Gilligan's Island?
Well, that's the television production I meant.
Yes, clearly. No, I did watch.
Okay.
Look, I saw somebody yesterday who's in full command of foreign policy and of international relations in a way that Donald Trump can only hope to dream to be.
Yeah, he might not even care to do the dreaming part.
Exactly. We could go down that.
I don't actually aspire to be that competent as president. I don't care.
Right. But of course, we know that Joe Biden. See, even I. Look, David.
You're mentally incompetent.
Right. I have 2 daughters and a wife. It's like maybe 50-50 when I say one of their names that I'm using the correct one.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, everybody does that, of course.
Everybody does that. If that was the test of mental competence, we'd all be ready for the asylum. Okay? So, but I understand that look, I just did it again. Jesus, excuse me. Now, Jesus.
Yeah, right. You weren't even talking about Jesus.
Right? Biden is not trying to show that he can do the job. He's trying to show that he can win the job. I think that a number of people have used that phrasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I saw, or what we culturally saw, because I monitor the monitoring. more than anything else. But yeah, and it was very interesting. And there was nothing definitive yesterday, and everybody's more or less confirmed their priors. So there were a few people moving in the middle of, well, okay. After a little while of warm up, he and some questions about things that are substantive, as opposed to immediate questions. He just finished a NATO conference. Aren't you incompetent? No, I am not. What else have you got? And he warmed up and did very well. But mostly people who came to see a diminished Biden, watched the first few minutes, concluded that it was true, and either left or just discounted the rest of what was discussed. But even they, by the end, said, well, there's no way, for instance, like Donald Trump could never answer any of these questions. And it prompted a new round, quite deservingly. Just please, someone ask any question. Ask the simplest questions in the world of Donald Trump and marvel at how vapid the answers are, if they're even answers at all. All true. But yeah, I think everybody kind of says, well, all right, Biden is moving slower and is impacted by his age, but he's competent to the task and understands the import of world affairs, domestic affairs, in a way that Donald Trump, as you said, not only could never dream of, but might not even care to aspire to that dream. So I think everybody acknowledges that, though, but except his fans. And apparently they're 50% of the country. So that's bad.
Right. Well, and we had a debate in which
yes,
Jake Tapper and his colleague, whose name escapes me. See, look, I can't do the job.
the Marianne of the debate. Yes.
He didn't say to him, why don't you explain your views on the Middle East? Because what would Trump have said? That Biden's a disaster.
Yeah.
And support Israel. Like he couldn't. We should know and have evidence that we could put up on screen to compare how Donald Trump answers those questions to how Biden did it again. How Biden answered them the other night or last night. See, it did it again.
Yes.
Seriously. And I'm pretty on the ball. You're going to really look at those things, and I promise I'm not doing that on purpose. I really am not.
That would be good cover. But
if a lot of names in your mind, they jumble. Yes. As it's getting between your brain and your mouth. That, especially when you're trying to do something under some pressure. And this interview with you, David, is a very high pressure situation.
Yes, exactly. If you can't get through this, what hope is there? Well, yeah, Biden has, he did have a couple of those stumbles, and they were particularly annoying ones in the sense that, like, well, everybody's got their eyes on me waiting for me to mix up names. But also, as others pointed out, as they were observing, he would correct himself afterwards, which, our amateur clinicians tell me, well, a person who's actually suffering from dementia or mental decline wouldn't be capable of recognizing the mistake right away and correcting it, or wouldn't bother if they even noticed it at all. But there were some high profile ones, like I want to be referring to Vice President Harris and instead say Vice President Trump, but Trump, of course, so looms large in everybody's mind. That's true. And then, of course, I guess earlier in the day, in referring to Ukrainian President Zelensky, but of course on everybody's mind at the moment then was Putin, and he transposed those names as well, and immediately, that's not what I meant. But other than that, certainly no major moments, no McConnell freezes, nothing like that. There's no reason to think that that's what the issue is. But everybody had eyes on him yesterday and seems to have performed well enough. And now we start looking to polling and asking people very complicated questions too, and we're getting complicated answers from very worried Democrats, but that is to say the baseline Democrat. The Democrats are constantly worried about these things, and it seems to me that what I see in the doubts expressed either in interviews or in aggregate in the polling is that they essentially are saying, well, I would like to have a race where this is a sure thing. I want to be assured that there's no chance that Donald Trump could win, or that we're going to be beating him up as viciously as possible between now and the election. And I'm afraid that Joe Biden can't produce that. But I don't know that there is anybody who can. But certainly people saying, well, I would rather have somebody who reassures me that we're definitely going to win. But they do also say, but if that doesn't happen, there's no chance in the world my vote will move. I will vote for Joe Biden. And then the worry will be, how long will he last, and how will we, under what circumstances will he end up having to replace him if his health declines? But I'm not voting for Donald Trump because I think, well, he's more together. I haven't heard anybody say that.
Right. And to circle back one more second on the
Yes.
on the names, think about the difference between what Biden did yesterday. Oh, the Harris Trump, which, like I said, is like what I do with my daughters, and Donald Trump very clearly and deliberately saying Nikki Haley should have called in the troops on January 6th because she's in charge of security.
Yes.
That's
repeatedly.
not a mixing up of the two names that are on the tip of your tongue. That's a complete a mistake on who is in charge on a particular day and in a particular role. I mean, right? Think about that. And think about the fact that and our listeners here haven't heard anybody in the mainstream media say, yeah, but Trump did this whole thing with Nikki Haley and Nikki Pelosi.
There you go.
Nikki Pelosi, look at me. Clearly, I can't be president. That's such a difference of kind, not even of degree, than what Biden did yesterday with Trump, Harris, or Zelensky, Putin.
Yes.
But Biden's got to go.
So.
Now, and I'm not even saying that I think Biden should or shouldn't go. Nobody's asking me, and I obviously have a dog in that hunt, I think, to use the Bill Clinton phrase. I don't have definitive data that tells me Biden must go. That definitive data is not there, to get back to the polling, right? I follow it obsessively. I know you do. Greg does, clearly. A 538 average went from about dead even right before the debate to at one point maybe about a 2.5% national popular vote lead for Trump. It's actually back down to 2.1%, and it's been steady in the low twos for about 7 or 8 days after the initial drop post-debate. Now, I mean, look, George H.W. Bush was down 17 points to Michael Dukakis in 1988. Did he drop out? No.
No.
Right? A 2-point national polling average is within the margin of error. So it's a slight move in Trump's direction, but we really don't. I don't see how you can say that's definitive enough data to tell a sitting president of the United States he's got to leave because he's definitely going to lose. If he couldn't do the job, that's a different story. But the man clearly can do the job. So the question is, can he win? And I don't see data that shows me he must leave.
It is a rather high bar to overcome, right? The idea of, well, incumbent president running for re-election has essentially already been nominated and reverse course over the summer. Yeah, you need to have some stronger indication than, well, true that Trump leads in the popular vote, which is kind of an anomaly in itself, but it's 2 points could certainly be noise, and could certainly be true, but just be situational. And in a few weeks, as things come back into balance, or they have another debate and he performs fine, or he has various other functions and satisfies most people that, well, okay, he's still there, everything's okay. I might hope for someone different for various reasons, higher energy, or just I've disagreed with him over policy, but he's the nominee and the other guy is disastrous. And that 2 points could 2 points could be turned around in a week if the conditions are right, or if there's enough noise in the poll. You're right, it's within the margin of error and there's not much to be made of it.
Right. And the other thing is that there's at least some evidence from what I've seen in the polls that have shown this, that the drop-off couldn't be explained by Democrats who would come back home if he was the nominee. Democrats who are like, I don't know, maybe they're moving from Biden to undecided or whatever. And these people would come back home. You're talking about overturning the will of millions of voters who picked him over the other people on the ballot. Granted, there were no other serious people running, but they did pick him. They could have.
Yes.
He did better than Trump did with his 75, 80% versus Biden's 90%.
Right. True. Also,
people love to say, well, it's either Biden or change. Well, it's not either Biden or change. It's Biden or somebody else. Generic Democrat, which is the equivalent of change, is always going to poll better than any specific candidate. They always do. Or, because generic Democrat has no flaws other than the flaws of Democrats in general.
Huh.
Right? We know, I shouldn't say we know. I know, and I think a lot of people know that it's not possible for the alternative candidate to be anybody other than Kamala Harris. It would tear the party apart. People, there are numbers of people who would be very upset. Black women, activists, people of color,
Sure.
South Asian Americans, and plenty of other people who would just be upset about the fact that, well, this person's name was on the ballot. They're the vice president. The primary voters voted for Biden-Harris for a lot of reasons. So all these people are like, I want Biden to drop out for Whitmer. Not going to happen. Not going to happen.
Yeah, I think we've largely, thankfully, I think, settled that. But it was a wild week or two as people were floating all these different names and coming up with procedures on the fly that they thought, those had no grounding in history or anything like that. This has not been done. But yeah, a little bit of magical thinking out there saying, well, I could imagine a process that I think is fair and democratic. Well, but you haven't put that to the test or thought through what someone else might even think about your process. But you're pretty sure it's fair because you designed it and you mean for it to be fair. But, other people may see it differently. So I think they've largely, thankfully, in the end, dismissed at least the idea of, well, someone flying in from out of left field. Although, just as people were coming to that conclusion, the polls that did mention other names were coming out. So we read through them. We acknowledge that there are other names being floated, but they're polling at 2% and 3%. Nobody's interested in a full swap like this. There's a whole reason behind why there was a vice presidential nominee in the first place and why we elected our vice president. This is what happens if Biden can't continue. The answer is Harris. That's all there is to it. Why make this panic worse than it has to be?
Right. And there's no process for it. There's no legitimate process for it. And the polling that has come out that's polled, everybody against Trump. I even saw one set of polls that included Al Gore. They all show Harris doing better than all of the other non-Biden candidates.
Yes.
It's only a couple of polls, but
good.
There's name recognition, whatever. And I want to cite one other one that an ABC Washington Post poll that came out yesterday, because I think one of the things that you're hearing, and this goes to media as well, media coverage as well. One of the things you're hearing is, well, so many people want Biden to step aside. Even if they say they're going to still vote for him, people want him to step aside. All right. So you've got this Washington Post article. It says it has the question, should Biden step aside? 67% of U.S. adults say Biden should step aside. Oh, gosh. Okay.
Yeah, that's scary sounding, I guess.
Okay. 56% of Democrats want him to step aside. Okay. And the article it covers that piece in general. Now, that poll also has Biden and Trump in a dead heat, each getting 46% of the vote. Despite that, so plenty of the people who want him to step aside are still saying they're going to vote for him. But let's stick with the should Biden step aside number. Later in the article, there's no real discussion of it, but later in the article, it also shows the data on should Trump step aside.
Aha. Well,
50%, good. 50% say Trump should step aside. Okay, but let's go deeper in that. So just to review, right. Biden, 67% should step aside. 56% of Democrats should step aside. Now let's do a little bit of amateur history professor math here. Okay. Democrats are about 1/3, Republicans are about 1/3, and independents are about 1/3. Okay,
sure.
So if we're going to say that 67% of adults said that Biden should step aside, okay, 56% of Democrats, roughly half of Democrats. So let's pull them out, okay? Half of 1/3, half of 33% is about 16%. Okay, so we're going to pull the 16% out, okay, from the 67. That leaves us with about 50% out of the remaining 2/3. Okay, 50% out of the remaining 2/3. 50% out of the remaining 66% think that Biden should step aside. The remaining 2/3 being Republicans and independents. 50 out of 66. Remember that, David. 50 out of 66 of the non-partisan for partisan party of Biden. Now let's go over to Trump.
Okay.
50% of adults say he should step aside. Only 11% of Republicans. Almost zero. To keep things simple, close enough to zero, I promise you.
Okay.
Take out their 1/3. Okay? That if you take out their 1/3 of the overall,
Of the electorate, right.
50% of adults, 50% say he should step aside, 50% out of the remaining 2/3, Democrats and independents. So lo and behold, with some very amateur math, when you take out the respondents from the party of the person you're asking about, Democrats for Biden, Republicans for Trump, you get basically the same percentage of independents plus Republicans for Biden and independents plus Democrats for Trump saying the person should step aside. If we assume that the group, the other party is going to be the same thing. Most of the people in the other party say that Biden should step aside. Most of the other people in the other party say Trump should step aside. With some rough analysis here, we're getting that independent
Yes.
thing.
That's that is good back of the envelope math, as they say, and an excellent point, right? Essentially, it looks about the same. I'm wondering too. I know that Republicans have been, I guess, musing. I don't know how many of them are actually telling pollsters this, but saying we actually prefer that Biden not drop out because we think he'll be easier to beat. So that may skew things. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time, just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Net Roots Radio. Ian Reifowitz still with us. We were heading into an important point, and this unfortunately timed break, I think, has interrupted us a little bit. But you were doing some real mathematical noodling on the back of the envelope here. I don't know why everyone carries envelopes with them for these things, but you could just use paper. But never mind. For some reason, everybody always has an envelope handy. And you were going through the rough mathematics to get to the conclusion that, well, were we saying then that it was essentially about the same number of people who weren't from each respective candidate's party saying, well, that person should drop out, and then why was it then that the focus was on only one?
In a nutshell, yeah, you just nailed it.
All right. Oh, okay. Well, I meant for you to nail it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it looks like
but
you can see independents as, are really the key there. If you want to know how people are feeling, does it, and what that should mean for, Democrats looking at whether Biden should drop out. Who cares what percentage of Democrats want Biden to drop out? 99% of them are going to vote for him anyway.
That is likely true and a good point.
And we care about what independents, nonpartisan, non-Republicans and Democrats, we care about what they think. So that's important. Second, it's important to recognize, yes, the article included both graphics, but there was almost no analysis of the kind that there was no analysis at all of the kind that I did, and there was no discussion of what the meaning of it is that 50% of the respondents said that Trump should drop out. Given the disparity between, again, over half of Democrats saying Biden should drop out and almost 11% of Republicans saying that Trump should drop out. That tells us a lot, okay? And it should be in the article. It tells us Republicans don't give a you-know-what about the fact that their guy doesn't know the difference between Nikki Pelosi and Nikki Haley. They don't care about the fact that Trump's performance in the debate was so riddled with lies as to be almost absurd. They don't care about that at all. So if you're not going to factor that in, you have to factor that in looking at the meaning of the two overall percentage of adults that think Biden should step aside and the percentage of adults that think Trump should step aside. Because without looking at the disparity, you're not getting the full picture.
Yes. And, as with many things, I think the question is interpreted differently, or even the meaning of the question, the import of the question is interpreted differently as between Democrats and Republicans and independents in their own way. Saying that Democrats think that Biden should step aside is, I think, just anecdotally to me, seems like when you ask Democrats, of course, there's the issue of, it's not so much that we think he's incompetent to the job as we just want to be assured that there's nothing standing in the way of a victory over Trump. But if there's no miracle, then I'll be voting for Biden, period. And just doing anything I can to stop Trump. There's that, but there's also, I believe as a Democrat, I feel as a Democrat that in Joe Biden or in any Democratic candidate, we have a candidate and a party where what people say about these things matters. That Joe Biden is a kind of person who will at least take this request or demand under advisement, whereas the notion that, Donald Trump might listen to our opinions on this and do the right thing, that's just not even a consideration for Republicans. Independents might lament that that's the case, and independents probably think, if enough of us also join in saying that Joe Biden should step aside, he'll feel that pressure. But there's no point in trying to pressure Donald Trump, so I won't even bother. I mean, he should step aside because he's terrible, but that's not a consideration for them.
Right, exactly. It's the difference between a functioning political party and a cult.
True. Also, right. Like the idea of this is essentially like, should Donald Trump step aside as leader of the Donald Trump party? No, he can't. Even if he shouldn't be involved in public life, but it's an absurd notion. I mean, I guess, how does it poll in Russia? Even if you tell people that they're not going to be arrested and assure them of that somehow, do you think President Putin should step aside? I mean, you should, but I don't know if that's really a relevant question. So I'll just say no to that, I guess. And of course, now we're now told, if Donald Trump wins, he would like to claim the power to single out and arrest all the people who said he should have stepped aside in the poll, and maybe we can identify them. And I don't know what kind of answers that will yield you either. It's an extraordinarily dangerous idea that electing Donald Trump, or even getting close to electing Donald Trump, is a safe thing to do in this country. It's just not anymore. But his fans don't care, and of course are certain that the leopards will never eat their faces. So I guess they tend to ignore it.
Right. And again, to reiterate, we had a real primary process. We had a process. We had votes. Yes. You've got to know that the person can't do the job in order to overturn millions of people voting. And I'm sorry, we just don't know that. Right. July 5th, Trump was leading on average by 2.5 points. 7 days later, that's already shrunk to 2.1. Who knows where it's going to be in 10 more days? Who knows where it's going to be in another month? But anyway, you don't have a justification for overturning the votes of millions of people and changing a democratic process into a process by which, James Carville and, Pat Sajak decide who the next nominee is going to be.
And Pat Sajak is a very conservative individual, by the way. And I know the reference is supposed to be the randomness of and vapidness of game show, but definitely a game show host you don't want making that decision. He may end up on the Supreme Court, though. So
Jimmy Kimmel is a much better person to make that selection.
Okay, yes, I would trust him better, and yet it would still be illegitimate.
Thank you.
All right. Then we've cleared that up. We've controlled for partisan lean and just focused on the illegitimacy part.
Yeah, you've got to isolate the variable in any.
Right. Exactly. We're getting back to your professorial roots here. So, I wanted to see if you were at liberty to discuss it all. What's coming up? What is it you're working on with your latest upcoming publication? Now that you have sabbatical time for it.
Right. So I have a co-author on this project, which I'm very happy about. And we are going to be, I don't want to go into the minutia of detail, but let's just say we're going to be looking at Trump's use of stereotypes.
Oh, okay.
His public rhetoric, obviously, I can't speak to his private rhetoric. But Trump's use of stereotypes over time, we're going to do a kind of academic analysis of how he has done that, what sort of methods he's using, not just I'm trying to win, but sort of academically speaking, what kinds of strategies is he using and using applying different theories of analysis to get a better understanding of how and why Trump uses stereotypes and what the impact is on listeners and on society as a whole.
It seems, it's his core in everything. Essentially that he's got mostly working off of stereotypes that I guess he formed in his own heyday. It seems like he's been stuck in the 80s with a lot of things. And but the whole core of his campaign right from the very beginning is from his first announcement speech, I guess, and to say that I'm going to try and jump on this anti-immigration bandwagon, which is already rolling. And that's a topic tailor-made for stereotyping, clearly. And it's interesting. It's been everything that's driven him politically, and I guess there must be, the truth is that at the core of his voter base shares the same stereotypes, and it'll be interesting to find out whether it was a clever exploitation of existing stereotypes or whether he's just it is interesting. He's been described as being his own base as well, right? It's not that he's cleverly appealing to the prejudices of an existing base. It's that he's essentially a talk radio show call-in guy that just suddenly takes over the hosting position.
Yeah, exactly. Look, obviously we're not discovering something new here. Everybody knows he's been using stereotypes, but we're kind of a rigorous analysis of it. But yeah, look, he came down the golden escalator or the gold-plated escalator or whatever, 2015, right? His initial speech, he's talking about Mexican people coming across the border saying, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Right off the bat, it's stereotyping.
Crazy. Even calling them Mexicans is stereotyping, as most of the migrants probably weren't even Mexican. They just...
That's a good point. Right. Exactly. Maybe in 2015,
possibly.
Straight from, I don't know, more than now maybe, because there is the migrant crisis from Central America has, I think, picked up since 2015. But either way, right, people coming across from Mexico, he's giving these stereotypes about crime, which, first of all, is incorrect. As we know,
yes,
as anybody who studies the data knows, that native-born, non-immigrant Americans, right, commit crimes at a higher rate than migrants or immigrants. We know this. So, if anything, this is not to suggest that I don't believe this, that everybody should be allowed to come in and there should be open borders, whatever, fine. But if you want to look at the crime, the more people who come in who are committing fewer crimes, the lower the crime rate is, and the less likelihood any person is of becoming a victim, because there are more people committing fewer crimes, in terms of that category. Not to go all mathy on us. We have other stereotypes, of course, right? We know Trump referred to countries in Africa and the Caribbean, which are predominantly black, as, right, quote unquote, whole countries. There's been all kinds of stereotypes. Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan district attorney, he called them handpicked and funded by George Soros. So you're bringing in a bit of a Semitic dog whistle there. But he also called Bragg a thug, right, which has racial connotations. Alvin Bragg is a black man. He also called him somebody who truly hates America, and spelled truly wrong in that particular.
Yes.
We can go on and on.
Yeah, well, it's all he's got, really. And I guess, as you were saying, are noting on the crime statistics, for instance, and we have the data and we're looking at the data. I guess for people for whom undermining the legitimacy of expertise and the idea that there's data that proves something, anything in particular, that's anathema to them as it is. And that only leaves you stereotypes to work with. And of course, nothing undermines a stereotype like actual hard data that shows that it's wrong and upside down and backwards. So they have to fight not only to preserve their preferred stereotypes, but if they at any point admit that science and data are legitimate, everything that they've been campaigning on will be undermined and destroyed.
Right, exactly. They don't just say, well, no, the data shows that what we say is correct. They say, data.
Yes, that's essentially it.
Right. I mean, they are literally Orwellian, and they rub it in your face, just like the Big Brother government did in 1984. Just 5 minutes ago, we told you that Oceania is at war with Pacifica or whatever. And then 5 minutes later, we are at war with Oceania, not Pacifica. No. And then 5 minutes later, we are at war with Pacifica, not Oceania. And we have always been at war with Pacifica, not Oceania. We know, that's wrong, but that.
That's really what it comes down to. And you're right. It is very 1984, of course. It's an important second theme in all of the government propaganda. There is not only are we lying to you, and we know it, and we know you know it, but we will lie a second time unnecessarily and say, we've always been telling you the same thing, or that's always been true. It strikes me because as we're watching these horrible backwards and upside down tortured decisions coming down from the Supreme Court, all when handed down by the conservative wing, based on this claim of originalism, of textualism. We've interpreted the words correctly, and only we are able to do this correctly, of the founders, and that these things they're overturning, in some cases, decades of doctrine, and in some cases, things that have been more or less, at least implicitly understood since the founding, or even from before the founding. In English law, understood these anti-corruption statutes, or presidential immunity, etc. These things have been understood this way throughout the history of the country and maybe before, but now they're insisting not only was that wrong, but it always was wrong, and all the rest of you misunderstood what liberty, freedom, etc., democracy meant to the founders. They actually meant the opposite the whole time, and only now are we revealing this to you. They wanted presidents to be immune and to function as kings, and they've always wanted that. Why aren't you seeing that? And there's 250 years of tradition in the other direction, but we're saying it anyway. As the wisest men in the country, the Supreme Court. That's pretty Orwellian by itself.
Right, and it's about power, especially when Trump does it. It's about, I have the power to lie, know that I lie, know that you know that I'm lying, but it doesn't matter. And it's about showing dominance. It's almost like a World Wrestling Federation move, or whatever you want to call it. It's about showing dominance.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a part of why I think that's one of the largest parts about Trump's appeal is he is the dominant alpha male or he is perceived as the dominant alpha male. And there are a lot of voters who say, I don't care that he's a son of a bitch. He's a son of a bitch for me. He's the alpha male.
Yeah.
All of these things work if you want to try to talk about explaining his appeal. If he can be dominant enough to make people believe his lies, even when they know they're lies, then maybe he's dominant enough to protect me from all the terrible things that are out there. Not to be a Trump vote whisperer, but that's a real thing. People want a guy who's going to protect them, and they see somebody they want a bully. They want a bully as long as it's a bully on their behalf. Now, if we believe in democracy, then we believe not only in wanting to be protected from enemies, foreign and domestic. That's part of the oath that the presidents swear. Right. But they also swear an oath to protect the Constitution. Actually, that is what they do. They don't swear an oath to protect the people. They swear an oath to protect the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And you could have I would argue, the kind of bully that Trump is would destroy the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin once said that, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the exact words, but if you choose to sacrifice liberty for security, you'll end up with neither. And to twist that, to apply that today, if we choose to sacrifice our constitutional democracy for some kind of security against whatever boogeyman Trump is saying is the boogeyman, including people who are Americans, right, like African Americans and other liberals or LGBT people, whoever Trump is saying is the boogeyman, if we're going to sacrifice the constitutional democracy for security against those people, we, as Franklin said, will end up with neither.
Yes. Yeah, well, he was pretty on it when it comes to these things. He had a lot to say that would be applicable to Trump's situation in particular, including, I guess, one of the lesser-known quotes that I keep running across every once in a while, now that the Supreme Court has decided that at least Donald Trump, if not all presidents, will largely have immunity from everything ever, including post-presidency, and that now that they've actually faced down oral arguments that posit that, yes, it would be permissible for a sitting president to order the assassination of a political rival that he was running against in a November election and send SEAL Team 6 to kill them, and that actually didn't lose the case for you. But now that we're faced with situations like this, my recollection in what was that? At least I've come across quotes, and it's dangerous to come across quotes on the internet, but I haven't seen anybody debunk this one yet. But asking about the impeachment power specifically and why it was included in the Constitution, and but Franklin commenting there on the idea, or I guess it hadn't been enshrined yet at that point, but that if you don't have some sort of civil process for the removal of a corrupt executive, there's only historically assassination as your removal mechanism, and nobody would set that down intentionally as a written instrument of government. That's what you want to avoid. The point of coming together in a constitutional democracy with a written constitution in particular is to avoid those sorts of situations and to avoid that kind of remedy wherever possible. But it's quickly becoming rendered impossible. I was thinking about this immunity decision and thinking I can already imagine if Trump were to assume office again and find himself probably inevitably impeached again, even although I guess if there was no, if it was a Republican House, nothing would move them to impeach. But even if they were moved to impeach, considering, I'm just anticipating the argument that Trump would say, well, I have presidential immunity, and you can only be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. And if I have immunity, then there was never any crime, and this impeachment itself needs to be thrown out. And would he probably look to the courts to intervene in congressional procedure and throw an impeachment out, which is not something that normally, traditionally, courts would have considered. But I don't know what this one would do. And it doesn't make any sense as an argument either. You can have a crime and just not be held liable for it. But I'm sure that he would conflate the two and say, if I can't be held liable for a crime, then there's clearly no basis for an impeachment either. And what would that leave you with? Well, Franklin did tell us, but it's dangerous and fraught to discuss it publicly. But that was the quote. That was the reasoning, and I think he's right there.
Absolutely, and there's also Alexander Hamilton in a couple of the Federalist Papers, pretty clear that he believed certainly, and he was one of the strongest for advocates of a strong executive. He said, in a republic where every magistrate ought to be personally responsible for his behavior in office. But then there's some other stuff that's not exactly relevant. But personally responsible for his behavior in office. We know what that means. We clearly know what that means. Look, if you read the court's decision, they talk about how could a president function properly if he didn't have this immunity? That's an argument for legislators or even drafters of a constitution to have, in order to say, well, this is why we should have an immunity clause. But it's not for the courts. The courts are supposed to decide not whether there should be an immunity clause or whether there should be immunity granted in the Constitution, but whether there is immunity granted in the Constitution. Either it is or it isn't. Doesn't matter whether it should be.
That's true.
It ain't.
That's supposed to be the balls and strikes of it. They may lament that it's not there, but they can't invent it.
Exactly. They should not be deciding what pitch should be thrown. It's whether it's a ball and strike, as you said. So to me, that is the best evidence that this court was, these conservative justices were completely off the rails. They might think there should be immunity. That's a fine thing. And I might think, kangaroos should eat peanut butter. Who cares?
Well, the kangaroos do. They're highly allergic. But yeah, no, I mean, you can come up with anything. And sometimes there are even legitimate things. I could see where you could make an argument that under certain circumstances, presidents ought to enjoy some sort of immunity. And I think it's probably even the case that most people would agree that, for instance, declaring war, Congress declares war, the president prosecutes this war. If afterwards you decided that all war was a war crime and that there is no legal way to prosecute a war, if you were of that opinion let's say, a member of Congress and looked to prosecute the president for properly carrying out a war that Congress, what we would traditionally understand as properly carrying out a war that Congress declared officially, ordinarily we say, no, that's not something you can do. This is what the presidential function is here. And so, yes, there might be a concept of presidential immunity. I think we've all already understood that to be the case. But expanding it the way they expand it, as you put it, right, it's not just calling balls and strikes. It's determining what pitches ought to have been thrown. And if they weren't thrown, just assuming that they would have been if you had given them the chance. In fact, you're out because that was a home run, but it should have been a slider, and you can't hit the slider. And if you had just thrown that, you'd be out. So you are out. No home run for you. That's pretty far from the job that John Roberts described for himself, and yet here he is writing this opinion.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and even in that example that that hypothetical example, you still wouldn't need immunity for the president because you can't be convicted there's no such thing as ex post facto, conviction.
True also, yes.
If it's not illegal when you do it, you can't be charged with a crime. If it was made illegal after you did the thing, you can't be charged for a crime. So even there, we were trying, you were just trying to come up with a scenario where you would need it. You really never need it. If it's against the law and the president does it, it's illegal. If it's not against the law.
Hey, that's familiar.
That sounds familiar, right?
Yeah.
Not against the law, then you don't need immunity for it. So you know what? The president just has to not break any laws, which isn't very difficult. And it's not like, again, but none of that stuff about should or shouldn't matters. That's not the Supreme Court's job.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, at least it wasn't certainly not the way that the Chief Justice described the job when he first took it. So it's, yeah, I don't know what to say. It's quite difficult to understand how they could come around to that conclusion. But, well, that's part of the danger that Trump poses, and part of the reason why I guess Democrats are so nervous about being able to field a candidate that they feel can definitely beat him, although I don't know that there's anybody that can satisfy that feeling. In the course of this discussion, I also wondered, it occurred to me, I wonder whether sometimes, as you say, Trump is doing this sort of thing on purpose and playing to his base. I wonder whether the crazier he sounds, or the more he promotes, for instance, his denies his Project 2025 and yet hints at that he will do those things, the more uncomfortable people become and the more demanding Democrats become that we substitute out Biden for somebody who can get rid of Trump for sure. And he fans the flames that way. The crazier he is, the more it makes Democrats nervous about their nominee.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop. Absolutely. I mean, look, what percentage of that 56% of Democrats who said that in that one poll that Biden should step aside are saying, boy, I really wish we could run a Barack Obama again, or, I really wish we could run some Michelle Obama or some ideal version, right? But that's just, that's how Democrats are. And then one last thing on the court, right? I mean, and again, I've read this. I'm not going to think of this. If the president was immune, the court have had to pardon Richard Nixon.
That's true. Yeah, that's, because we actually understood what was going on at that point and understood what the Constitution demanded. It's amazing how far they have come in the wrong direction. Excellent point, Ian. I appreciate your being with us, and hopefully we can get back together sometime again soon. I wish you good luck with the book. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, we continue on with our second hour, and sadly, Ian Reifowitz actually has a life, and had to go and take care of it. Gave us a full hour there out of a valuable a couple weeks of sabbatical time, and exciting news that he's working on a new book. And by the way, if you are new enough to the show not to have heard Ian before, well, you would almost certainly, of course, have run into his writing over at Daily Kos, and perhaps you even caught him on TV in a couple places. He's made various appearances on the various channels offering his expertise there. But if you were somehow otherwise unfamiliar, would be his fourth book, I think. And let's see, most recently, I think and let me I can get the list of books here, and I'll lean on Wikipedia to give me the order of all these books. 2012's book, Obama's America, and certainly we've spoken at great length over the years about President Obama's record. The Tribalization of Politics, another of his 3 works already published. I don't know what the title of the new and upcoming book is, or whether they've decided on that. And but going back further, this one I don't think we've ever discussed, because we're rather focused, of course, on domestic politics here. But they're further back, Imagining an Austrian Nation. How about that? I don't think we've ever spent any time discussing the long ago European history aspect of Ian's career. Maybe that could be the topic for another day, and we'll excite our Austrian American audience. But the ones we've discussed at length, Obama's America, a transformative vision of our national identity, and the tribalization of politics, this one we talk about all the time, how Rush Limbaugh's race-baiting rhetoric on the Obama presidency paved the way for Trump. I don't see how you could avoid discussing that at any point over the past, what are we on, like 8 to 10 years at this point of dealing with Rush Limbaugh's America having given way to Trump, not to mention all the time we spent just having to deal with Rush Limbaugh himself. Anyway, so as I mentioned earlier at the top of the show, there is a New York Times acknowledgement from the editorial board here that, yes, it is also true that Donald Trump is unfit to lead, and maybe it might be worth mentioning at some point. And I guess now is that point, although honestly, any time during the last 8 years would have been fantastic, but we've gotten around to it now. So as I mentioned, it's one of those very graphic pieces in the sense that if you're reading online, oh, and I forgot to ask whether Ian had a hard print copy of the Times to tell us how that appears in the Times. But if you are reading online, you will have a waving American flag as background here as you scroll down through several pages worth of lead in to the title of the piece and then the text. He is dangerous in word, deed, and action. And if you scroll a little bit, he puts self over country. He loathes the laws we live by. Excellent point, and one we were just discussing at the end of Ian's segment. And now the title, Donald Trump is unfit to lead, by the editorial board. So let's read it. We deserve it at this point. Next week, for the third time in 8 years, Donald Trump will be nominated as the Republican Party's candidate for President of the United States. A once great political party, they describe themselves, of course, as grand, but a once great political party now serves the interests of one man, a man as demonstrably unsuited for the office of president as any to run in the long history of the Republic, a man whose values, temperament, ideas, and language are directly opposed to so much of what has made this country great. It is a chilling choice against this national moment. For more than 2 decades, large majorities of Americans have said they are dissatisfied with the direction of the country, and the post-COVID era of stubborn inflation, it really isn't. I mean, high interest rates, not that either. Social division, yes, and political stagnation, maybe, has left many voters even more frustrated and despondent. Although nothing more signifies political stagnation than nominating the same candidate 3 times in a row. But what can I tell you? The Republican Party once pursued electoral power in service to solutions for such problems, maybe, to building the shining city on a hill, as Ronald Reagan liked to say. And by the way, he actually had Alzheimer's the second time he ran, but everyone couldn't wait to install him as president again. Its vision of the United States, embodied in principled public servants like George H.W. Bush, yes, John McCain, and Mitt Romney, gulp, was rooted in the values of freedom, sacrifice. Mitt Romney was sacrificing left and right, individual responsibility, and the common good. The party's conception of those values was reflected in its long-standing conservative policy agenda, and today many Republicans set aside their concerns about Mr. Trump because of his positions on immigration, trade, and taxes. But the stakes of this election are not fundamentally about policy disagreements. The stakes are more foundational. What qualities matter most in America's president and commander-in-chief? And by the way here, I think that's always kind of been background, a part of our decision-making, what character or what qualities matter most in an American president and commander-in-chief, but only because there's been a universal assumption and understanding between, across party lines about what a president can and can't do, should and shouldn't do. But once you throw all of that out, well then, yes, that matters a great deal. And of course, if you're going to throw those, there certainly have been people that have fantasized about the power they could wield if you would throw all of those constraints out. Or if you had a king rather than a president, if you want to go all the way back to our first president, where it was imagined in the pre-founding, post-revolution, but pre-founding, there was, legitimate discussion. Should we just set up our own king? And it just, gotten out of that situation. But I mean, the legitimate international community of nations was a nation run by kings. And that's how you established yourself as a real and serious player in what passed as world affairs, European-centric, of course, world affairs. Everybody had a king. Why not have our own king? We'll get a good person as a good king, but then, sense and reason overcame everybody, thankfully. Well, it wouldn't work out all that well, because once you're finished with, say, George Washington as king, and maybe you could name a few other people right now who would make good ones, but in the future you have no idea you can't evaluate the personality of the politicians of the future. And of course, there would be no reason to believe that a hereditary king would make any particular sense for Americans. You'd run into a problem right away, of course. And maybe that was some of the thinking too. We should make George Washington king. Yeah, but he has no sons. Well, that would be a dumb thing to do, to turn to monarchy at this point, hereditary monarchy, and immediately have a succession crisis. But in addition, thankfully, there were political thinkers who thought better of the idea of having a king, hereditary or otherwise. We don't know what the character of the people leading the nation is always going to be. We need to have mechanisms in place to control them if they have contrary ideas that would threaten liberty. So they set this whole thing up for this particular reason. And so that Americans were free largely to consider matters of personal character and personal virtue, because they would be good indicators of someone, well, one, who would agree to work within the boundaries we had set out for ourselves, and two, could largely probably be trusted not to trash those barriers so that you could go crashing through them. But now this is no longer the case with Donald Trump, who just undermines the legitimacy of the barriers and the boundaries that we've placed on civil conduct of all kinds. And that's the person least suitable for being given free rein, right? Even George Washington wasn't fully trusted to just simply take the reins as a king, and he was perhaps a unique person. But yeah, if you're not going to throw out the constraints of democracy for George Washington, you're not going to want to throw out the constraints of democracy for Donald Trump. I don't think anybody besides Donald Trump gives himself a favorable evaluation as against George Washington. But anyway, back to the New York Times piece. Mr. Trump has shown a character unworthy of the responsibilities of the presidency, to say the least. He has demonstrated an utter lack of respect for the Constitution, the rule of law, and the American people. Instead of a cogent vision for the country's future, this would be enough all by itself, I would say. Instead of a cogent vision for the country's future, Mr. Trump is animated by a thirst for political power, to use the levers of government to advance his interests, satisfy his impulses. It's more than just self-interest. I mean, it's impulsive at that. And exact retribution against those who he thinks have wronged him. And by the way, that's everybody. It's not even just people who've gotten in the way of his political agenda. It's anybody who's ever laughed at him in his view. Anybody who's ever thought that he was a jerk. Well, I'll show you. So remember that. He is quite simply unfit to lead. The Democrats are rightly engaged in their own debate about whether President Biden is the right person to carry the party's nomination into the election, given widespread concerns among voters about his age-related fitness. This debate is so intense because of legitimate concerns that Mr. Trump may present a danger to the country, its strength, security, and national character, and that a compelling democratic alternative is the only thing that would prevent his return to power. All right? I don't know whether they come out and say it here, but the subtext of this should be understood that the debate over whether or not Biden ought to continue is a debate over whether or not we can be assured that he can stop Trump. The debate over whether or not Trump should drop out is a debate about Trump's actual personal, moral, and everything else, moral and what's the word I'm looking for here? His ability to perform the job, much less his personal, his personality that makes him particularly not only unfit for the job, but uninterested in even attempting to meet the responsibilities of the job. This is about him not ever being able to accomplish the task of reaching fitness for the job. Whereas the question about Biden is he can do the job. He's got the moral character to do the job. It's just a question of will he be able to convincingly and always convincingly be able to beat Trump and be seen to be beating Trump and stop worrying me. It's not because people don't think he should do the job. It's that we need somebody to win this election. If the election could, I don't know, if this was the end of his second term and there was another Democrat running for office, nobody would be talking about removing him from office. And they wouldn't be worried about him because the job of beating Trump would have fallen to somebody else. It's not the same question being asked here. So, where were we with this one? It's this debate is so intense on the Democratic side because of legitimate concerns that Trump may present a danger to the country and that a compelling Democratic alternative is the only thing that could prevent his return to power. Although I guess here, even I got to get off track again. By the way, that's a good phrasing of it, preventing Trump's return to power, not necessarily prevent his prevailing in the election, because that's not actually, in Trump's mind, the chief barrier to his returning to power. He can lose the election and return to power, and he fully intends to do so. But if he can win the election along the way, so much the better in his view. It is a national tragedy that the Republicans have failed to have a similar debate about the manifest moral and temperamental unfitness of their standard bearer, instead setting aside their longstanding values, closing ranks, and choosing to overlook what those who worked most closely with the former president have described as his systematic dishonesty, corruption, cruelty, and incompetence. That task now falls to the American people. Terrific. We urge voters to see the dangers of a second Trump term clearly and to reject it. The stakes and significance of the presidency demand a person who has essential qualities and values to earn our trust. And on each one, Donald Trump fails. So there you go. All right. Then they illustrate, I guess they have some accompanying pieces that you could spend your time on. What the nature of these things are, I do not know. But let's see. They have an additional essay, Moral Fitness Matters. And I don't know how long that piece is. But I mean, it certainly does. And then there's, this is interesting. This is a very, you know what? That's not the end of the piece. It continues after these other graphical offers of these sidebar discussions, which might be just as important. But let's see. I guess the rest of the actual editorial piece. Election day is less than 4 months away. The case against Mr. Trump is extensive, and this board urges Americans to perform a simple act of civic duty in an election year. Listen to what Mr. Trump is saying. It's very hard, but go ahead. Pay attention to what he did as president and allow yourself to truly inhabit what he has promised to do if returned to office. Voters frustrated by inflation and immigration or attracted by the force of Mr. Trump's personality. Well, first of all, if you're frustrated by inflation and immigration, you're out of your mind. The numbers indicate that there's far less of a reason to be concerned now that Donald Trump is not president than you had when he was president. Immigration, in terms of what they complain of, illegal migration, as they put it, into the country, has diminished. Inflation, much diminished. I mean, the pandemic inflation handed to us by Trump's incompetent handling of the pandemic. I mean, if you're one of the people out there that likes to counter the argument that Trump flubbed, and I mean incredibly, dropped the ball on handling the pandemic, but then point out, well, more people died during the pandemic under the Biden administration than the Trump administration. Well, it's been around longer in the Biden administration than the Trump administration, for one thing. But if you can't see the difference in their handling it, for instance, you can at least look at the difference economically in the way things were handled. Well, sure, but the pandemic was that much more of an emergency during the 1 year that the Trump administration presided over it versus the entirety of the Biden administration. But I mean, look at the results. The answer is to what looked to be like something that could have spiraled into a second Great Depression was handled with, let's say, great aplomb by the Biden administration. And the economy, which is, after all, what it's all about, stupid, apparently, that stupid economy, stupid, is, I mean, you can't argue with the results of the Biden administration on that front. So, of course, you just have to lie about it and argue about it as though truth didn't matter and screw the numbers, we don't care. So back to what they were saying. Voters frustrated by inflation and immigration or attracted by the force of Mr. Trump's personality, which is horrific, should pause and take note of his words and promises. They have little to do with unity and healing and a lot to do with making the divisions and anger in our society wider and more intense than they already are. The Republican Party is making its choice next week. Soon all Americans will be able to make their own choice. What would Mr. Trump do in a second term? He has told Americans who he is and shown them what kind of leader he would be. When someone fails so many foundational tests, you don't give him the most important job in the world. And that's true, and not a bad conclusion, but I'm compelled to say more, as usual. He has told Americans who he is and shown them what kind of leader he would be. What kind of choices, what would he do in a second term? Maybe more to the point than all of that. I mean, one, we know intuitively, based on what he's done before and what he says now. Two, they have a written plan for it, Project 2025, and the various other things that have gone into it. The Article 3 project. There's a lot of projects out there. Now they're all merged under this Project 2025. But even more interesting, almost, than the things that he says he wants to do is that he now says, now that it's unpopular and becoming a widespread topic of discussion, denies that these are the things that he wants. Oh, I don't know who wrote this. The idea of denying responsibility, ducking responsibility for Project 2025 is absurd. I'm thankful that the press has been pretty clear on that and that this is backfiring. But imagine not only being so destructive to everything that Americans used to anyway, tend to hold dear, but then lying about actually that being your agenda when it turns out to be enormously unpopular. I'm thinking back once again to the pandemic, right? At least my administration was responsible for Project Warp Speed. Project Warp Speed. I'm very smart. Donald Trump's uncle, Dr. John Trump, professor at MIT. That's how I know all these things. And we developed the vaccine, which at his rallies calls for boo, boo, we hate the vaccine. Oh, well, in that case, screw the vaccine. Everybody hates it. We all hate the vaccine. Really? Really? But, yeah, here, too. What will my second-term agenda be? It will be this. Mainstream America says, oh, my gosh, disgusting. Then I don't know who wrote it. Coffee Boys, I can't tell you. I have nothing to do with this whatsoever. complete lie, as we're also watching him do it on the subject of abortion, and that one seems to be kind of working, and that the press likes to write he's softening on abortion. No, he's lying. He's picking a softer lie to tell people about abortion, and then gonna, look, if he won't be bound by the Constitution, he's not going to be bound by the Republican platform. That's ridiculous. Don't even fool yourself for a second. If you think that's the case, you're nuts. Now, by the way, so there were these other side essays, which would probably take the rest of the show to get all the way through, but to give you some idea of what they've added here. This is a very weird format, and it's interesting what they do with the graphical presentation that online presents them. I imagine these things are in print too, but it's just an interesting flow to get to these others. So in addition to the editorial itself, they have a piece on moral fitness mattering. Each of these things matter, of course, and that's part of the title. What things matter? Moral fitness, principled leadership, character, a president's words, and the rule of law. So you could be here all day. You want to see, well, how about moral fitness matters? Just because, one, it really does, and he's disgusting on that front. And to give you an idea of what are they going to be discussing, the first one out of the five here. Presidents are confronted daily with challenges that require not just strength and conviction, but also honesty. Whoops, oh well. Humility. If there's a defining characteristic of Donald Trump, it's that he not only is not humble, but hates humility. I mean, he really does. It's like, that's the running joke of Donald Trump from even before he was president. The idea, when he first discovered Twitter, that was about the best illustration I've ever seen of the Trump style, that he said that his tweets were, many people are coming up to me in the streets and saying, Donald, how are you so good at the Twitter? How is it that you say such great things on Twitter? And many people are astonished because sometimes it's said, a guy comes up to me and says, that was the greatest bunch of words I've ever seen written before. And he says this sort of stuff about himself all the time, right? I've made the most beautiful building. People are saying to me, architecturally, Donald, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. No one's ever said that about the Trump Tower or anything that he's built. Taj Mahal, the U.S. Capitol building, the Empire State Building. I don't know, but iconic architecture that's out there in the world. And people actually like the lobby of Trump Tower and its beautiful shops and restaurants as the best thing. They say it's the best thing ever. Anyway, I better not get too distracted or we'll never get through this. Presidents are confronted daily with challenges and yada, yada. But these things that the president is faced with require not just strength and conviction, and he doesn't have those, but he likes to say he does, but also honesty, humility, selflessness, no way, fortitude, and the perspective that comes from sound moral judgment. I think I'm going to buy a teenage beauty pageant and walk into the dressing rooms and try and see teenage girls naked. But I think I should also have sound moral judgment and be president. If Mr. Trump has these qualities, Americans have never seen them in action on behalf of, not on the nation, behalf of the nation's interests, certainly. His words and actions demonstrate a disregard for basic right and wrong, and a clear lack of moral fitness for the responsibilities of the presidency, and maybe even just to be allowed around children, I would add. He lies blatantly and maliciously, embraces racists, abuses women, and has a schoolyard bully's instinct to target society's most vulnerable. And by the way, when we say he's a schoolyard bully, he's not interested in school. His interest in school as a school kid was, it's a place where I could go to bully people. It's a source of victims, and I have to go. My parents are making me go. But he certainly didn't learn anything in the school. He has delighted in coarsening and polarizing the town square with ever more divisive and incendiary language. Mr. Trump is a man who craves validation and vindication so much that he would prefer a hostile leader's lies to his own intelligence agency's truths. and would shake down a vulnerable ally for short-term political advantage. And I think we're all aware of who he's talking about here. His handling of everything from routine affairs to major crises was undermined by his blundering combination of impulsiveness, insecurity, and unstudied certainty. That is a great way of putting it. This record shows what can happen to a country led by such a person. America's image, credibility, and cohesion were relentlessly undermined by Mr. Trump during his term. None of his wrongful actions are so obviously discrediting as his determined and systematic attempts to undermine the integrity of elections, the most basic element of any democracy, an effort that culminated in an insurrection at the Capitol to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power. How could you be thinking about peacefully transferring power to this guy? It's insane. There's much more to it. We're probably fading out. We'll take a 2-minute break, come back, sum up some of this, and move on for one more half hour. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, so much more to get to, and yet so little time to do it. But let's continue on, just because it's interesting to see the power of these New York Times editorial words. I mean, it's just interesting to finally see it all acknowledged, and it should be pretty impactful. Not only is there an editorial from the entire editorial board saying he's unfit, but there are 5 separate sidebars on precisely why he's unfit for some of these things. Maybe one of the bigger compilations of Donald Trump's fatal flaws that I've ever seen. And we're only going to make it through one of them, and you can enjoy the other 4 over the weekend. So let's continue on here. On January 6, 2021, Mr. Trump incited a mob to violence with hateful lies, then stood by for hours as hundreds of his supporters took his word and stormed the Capitol with the aim of terrorizing members of Congress into keeping him in office. He praised these insurrectionists and called them patriots. Today, he gives them a starring role at campaign rallies, playing a rendition of the national anthem sung by inmates involved with January 6th. And he has promised to consider pardoning the rioters if reelected. I think he's been more explicit than that. He's promised to actually go ahead and do it. He continues to wrong the country and its voters by lying about the 2020 election, branding it stolen, despite the courts, the Justice Department, and Republican state officials, by the way, disputing him. No man fit for the presidency would flog such pernicious and destructive lies about democratic norms and values, but the Trumpian hunger for vindication and retribution has no moral center. To vest such a person with the vast powers of the presidency is to endanger American interests and security at home as well as abroad. And I think that'll probably be my next topic. The nation's commander-in-chief must uphold the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. It is the closest thing that this secular nation has to a sacred trust. But, of course, the Christian nationalists would substitute their own. The president has several duties and powers that are his alone. He has the sole authority to launch a nuclear weapon. He has the authority to send American troops into harm's way and to authorize the use of lethal force against individuals in other nations. Americans who serve in the military also take an oath to defend the Constitution, and they rely on their commander-in-chief to take that oath as seriously as they do, because otherwise, of course, they could be ordered into battle to, say, protect Trump properties abroad, or domestically, for that matter, or you could nuke hurricanes, or you could nuke everybody in the entire world. They're all against me. I'm going to kill everybody on the planet. I'm going to be the last inhabitant. Do it. I'm the commander-in-chief. Yes, sir. Well, I don't think so. Anyway, again, we'll get into the foreign affairs part of it later, because I got another story I got to get to. But still, I want to get through at least one of these things so you can get some idea of what they're saying. The lack of moral grounding undermines Mr. Trump even in areas where voters view him as stronger and trust him more than Mr. Biden, like immigration and crime, for some reason. Veering into a kind of brutal excess that is at best immoral and at worst unconstitutional, he has said that undocumented immigrants were, quote, poisoning the blood of our country, unquote, and his advisors say he would aim to round them up in mass detention camps and end birthright citizenship. He has indicated that if faced with episodes of rioting or crime surges, he would unilaterally send troops into American cities. He has asked aides if the United States could shoot immigrants below the waist to slow them down. And he has said that he would use the Insurrection Act to deploy the military against protesters. And by the way, he has also advocated ultimate fighting championship style public bouts among migrants somehow, like to win the right to enter the country. That's the most unserious thing I've ever heard of in my life. During his time in office, none of those things happened because there were enough people in military leadership and with the moral fitness to say no to such illegal orders. But there are good reasons to worry about whether that would happen again, as Mr. Trump works harder to surround himself with people who enable rather than check his most insidious impulses. And you know how the founders were interested in enabling and balances rather than checks and balances. The Supreme Court, with its ruling on July 1st, granting presidents absolute immunity for official acts, has removed an obstacle to Mr. Trump's worst impulses, the threat of legal consequences. What remains is his own sense of right and wrong, and he hasn't got one of those. Our country's future is too precious to rely on such a broken moral compass. And quite honestly, feeding your goldfish is too precious to rely on such a broken and moral compass. So don't trust him with that either. Like as I said, there's more to this one. Other things that matter and that they treat equally, at equal length. Principled leadership matters. If you think they didn't focus on that enough already in what we've read. Character matters. Imagine there's more about that. A president's words matter, and then finally, the rule of law matters, all of which deserve individual attention, but you're going to have to give it your attention over the weekend on your own, although many of you have canceled your New York Times subscription, so I'm not certain how many of you will be able to do it, but you ought to be gifted a pass to read this thing without a subscription. I don't know. Maybe there's a version of that out there, or maybe I can do that and provide a gift link in the roundup for today. All right. I said that there was another story I wanted to get to, and really, this is great discussion fodder for all the things that can remind you of that you want to say about Donald Trump. But I feel like I got to get to something else in particular. I mentioned to you that there's the foreign policy component of their complaints, their correct complaints, has a corresponding hook in today's news. I spotted this one yesterday, as many of you did, from CNN, an exclusive at the time, anyway, to CNN. This is interesting, and, I'll just go right to it. The U.S. and Germany have foiled a Russian plot to assassinate the CEO of an arms manufacturing company that is sending weapons to Ukraine. See what's happening here? So, Katie Bolillis, Natasha Bertrand, and Frederick Pleitgen are the authors on this CNN piece. So, an arms manufacturer, a private, company, manufacturing arms and selling them among other places, I'm sure, but selling them to Ukraine, targeted for assassination by the Russians. I mean, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the motivation and I don't know, whatever the motivation of it, except that normal countries aren't supposed to act this way, right? So this is just the will of Vladimir Putin substituting for that of a sovereign nation here and saying, well, we're fighting a war in Ukraine. And on the one hand, we're sorry that people are sending any weapons to them because we would win this war a lot faster if they were not sending those weapons. And there are tools that normal countries legitimately have to register their displeasure. They could break off diplomatic ties with the country that was providing those weapons, I guess. But it's not a country here. It's a private concern. They could, I guess you could levy sanctions against them, et cetera, et cetera. But this is interesting. Instead, they are just simply saying, well, why don't we kill the CEO of the company and make it clear that we did do that so that the next CEO of the company, because they'll get another CEO. We understand that. And it's a business concern. They're going to want to continue selling weapons. But if we kill the CEO and kind of sort of hint that it was us, I don't know if we want to say it outright, but then the next CEO will probably continue to make weapons and continue to sell them, but won't sell them to Ukraine, and that'll be one of the suppliers out of the way. And other suppliers who currently supply weapons to the Ukraine will probably also want to get out of that game because they'll think we're going to assassinate them too. And we will. So they are right, and they will do so. It's insane. We don't work that way. But of course, Vladimir Putin has realized, now, in the modern context, what are they going to do about it, right? I'll have someone assassinate this CEO. That's an act of war. NATO has a pact. This is an attack on Germany, the heart of NATO, some would say, and or at least the heart of the point of NATO, anyhow. And this is an attack on one. This is an Article 5 call that everyone needs to consider an attack on all. And what alternatives do we have to war with Russia? Except war with Russia likely means all-out war and possibly even nuclear conflagration. And so realistically speaking, is that something we're going to do, or are we going to seek some other solution, some other reason why Article 5 doesn't call for an attack on Russia or even a ground invasion of Russia, if not a nuclear war with Russia? Well, anything's preferable to that. And Putin knows it. And so he says, well, you know, what? There's going to be sanctions. There's going to be anger. There's going to be consequences, but they'll mostly be visited, if anything at all, on the Russian people, about whom I do not care. And I will live in my billion-dollar bunker and continue on with what remains of my oligarchy and see how long it can last. So he feels empowered to do this. So here's the issue, right? So what has happened here is the U.S. and Germany have together foiled this Russian plot to assassinate the CEO of this arms manufacturing concern. And there's a whole story to it. And I'm sure it's all very intriguing and interesting. But I actually came by to make the point. I would love to read this story, but we'll run out of time to make the larger point, which is, again, I know you know where we're going with this, but it needs to be said, and you need to say it to people that you know, and the New York Times need to say it too when they're writing editorials like this, but they didn't have this one in front of them at the time, I'm sure. But the difference here is Donald Trump as president does not contact German authorities about this to foil the plot. What happens here is U.S. intelligence agencies become aware of Russia's plot to assassinate this German CEO, and they alert German authorities, and together German and U.S. authorities thwart the Russian plot. Donald Trump, as president in this situation, intervenes in the situation to warn not the Germans, but the Russians. Your plot has been discovered. You need a plan B to assassinate this guy. I may or may not offer help even in coming up with that plan B, but he warns the victims, in his view, in all of this are, what about all those poor Russians who were going to try to assassinate this evil German who's helping the Ukrainians, who are terrible, terrible people. Of course, very corrupt, and maybe also Nazis. And he intervenes on the side of Russia in this. I think that's very clear. And I want to read the article's details just to see what inflection points there were in all of this for Donald Trump to intervene on the wrong side. But it led me to something yesterday. I was summarizing things by saying, look, not only would he have not alerted the Germans and would have alerted the Russians instead, but the fact is that Donald Trump thinks that America's main alliance internationally should be with Russia and not with our traditional post-war NATO partners. He thinks Russia makes a better ally for various reasons, most of which are illicit, but for various reasons, than our traditional Western European democracies and Canada and all the various members of NATO and the other international treaty organizations that have as their aim the containment of either, containment of Russia and or China and their allies. So, I mean, that's on its face, not all by itself, an illegitimate position to take. It's unpopular and contrary to our history. But, I mean, you could say, look, if it's in the long-term interests of the United States legitimately, and I mean here the general interest of the United States, not just me, but if it's in the interest of the United States to ally itself with Russia instead of NATO, that's a legitimate topic for discussion. And there's a process. I'm not certain I could describe it for you accurately because this would be a momentous shift. But there would need to be government-wide consensus about that. I mean, look, we weren't, we set ourselves in opposition to the Soviet Union very early on. And yet, in the context of World War II, found ourselves allied with the Soviet Union. And then very quickly, when the convenience of that alliance was over with, back in a Cold War situation with the Soviet Union. So we've gone back and forth on what substitutes for Russia in that picture before. And it's a thing you can do, shifting alliances. It has happened. It hasn't happened for a long time because there's not the post-war era for the United States is the only one in which really internationally its alliances made a difference and people cared about them. So the history is short. So we haven't had the opportunity to make these shifts before. Well, I mean, I guess in the so-called special relationship with Britain, well, let's see. At one point, we were just flat out at war with Great Britain and then became special friends and allies later on. So there's been at least that one shift. But yes, you could theoretically decide that Russia was the better ally than the Western alliances, but it can't be implemented at one person's whims, right? As I was saying yesterday, essentially, Trump thinks our alliance should be with Russia and not with our traditional post-war partners. The fact that there are, though, significant doubts about Trump's personal pecuniary interests with Russia is part of what makes, for instance, the Supreme Court ruling that you can't examine his motivations in official acts so dangerous. All right, now I'm mixing up these two items here, but just to try to get to the point a little faster, I guess. It's as I said, it's not necessarily illegitimate on its face to prefer an alliance with Russia to an alliance with NATO partners, but you can't implement it on a whim. You can't do it without government-wide consensus. You get the State Department on board. Now you can fire everybody at the State Department and replace them with your people. Yes. And you could do it rather quickly, I guess, under Trump's view of things, but you would have to do that. You would have to get Congress on board. And you could be able to do that with a gerrymandered map, et cetera, et cetera. I guess the fact that all those options are actually available to you with a little bit of work is why nobody thinks that it shouldn't be done at the presidential whim. The president can make it happen if he convinces people to come along and has enough supporters that he can place in the strategic parts of government to get to government-wide consensus. Now, you can't do it all by yourself on a whim. You can't do it without government-wide consensus. And especially, You can't do it when most of the rest of government, as it's currently constituted, actually suspects that Russia is bribing Donald Trump to do this. So, you might want to examine that. However, interestingly enough, the official act of realigning the United States with Russia rather than NATO, should that come to pass, is now of the sort that John Roberts, anyway, says you can't examine the motivations behind it. Even if it turns out, as everybody believes right now, that the motivations are personal and pecuniary, that they are just bribing him to do this. He may also have thought it was a good idea, though, and that's to the Supreme Court. We're at the stage where the Supreme Court says, well, he might have made that shift anyway, just as they're saying, well, Bob Menendez might have voted in support of the Egyptian position anyway. We don't know that he was getting a bribe. Maybe it was just a gratuity, right? They're doing some awful, awful things and removing some serious checks and balances, not only against the president, but other elected officials. And it's dangerous, especially at this particular moment. So, would shifting U.S. allegiance from NATO to Russia be an official act? It could be, and probably would be under normal circumstances. Would accepting bribes to do it be an official act? It shouldn't be. Of course, you could consider them gratuities, but it shouldn't be. But curiously enough, in granting this weird immunity decision, the Supreme Court says you can't examine the president's motives, even for something this obviously unofficial and potentially treasonous. He's been getting money, or he's been given deals to build a Moscow tower, or whatever it is, in order to keep him on the Russian side, or move him to and keep him on the Russian side. Can we look at that? No, you can't examine his motivations. It's an official act. Really? Even if we think he's being bribed? Yes, and not only that, but you can't try to convince anybody that this is unofficial by bringing this evidence you have that he's being bribed and asking judges to declare this stuff obviously unofficial because of the pecuniary interest he's got in it. You can't even produce it as evidence. That's crazy. It's nuts. It's a formula for disaster. It's almost as if it was tailor-made to bring about this particular disaster. And how odd it is that we are now, thank you, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, finally filing a impeachment resolution, not against John Roberts, curiously enough, but rather against Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito for slightly varying reasons. But one of the reasons, at least in the case of Clarence Thomas, clear indications that he's just simply out there taking bribes. So how interesting that the Supreme Court that is out there taking bribes in at least one instance, maybe more, Alito now suspected of much the same behavior, although on a lesser scale, but equally guilty of bad behavior, the reason for which judges can be impeached, it's enumerated in the Constitution. But how odd that a Supreme Court that apparently is taking bribes now says, well, bribes aren't so bad if you call them by a different name, and you can't really look at that stuff anyway in determining whether or not the president is going to enjoy his immunity. So you might ask yourself, what would the court even look at here? Like, what would be the alternative reasoning besides outright bribery that would allow them to say, well, you can't look at motivations. He could have been motivated by something else. I guess they would probably still at this point, John Roberts would be embarrassed to say, if you have direct evidence of bribery, even as we would describe it, well, then I'd have a hard time considering that an official act. But if there was an alternative reason out there, maybe we could just point to that. So why, besides straight ahead bribery, would Donald Trump prefer an alliance with Russia instead of our NATO partners, right? That would be the question. A more legitimate sounding answer, a more legitimate sounding explanation, if you were interested in coming up with one, would be Trump simply he better understands and appreciates the transactional relationship that he would have with Russia. He understands transactional relationships better than abstract ideological ones. And he sees Russia, Putin, and his oligarchs as transactional people like him, right? For Trump, the transactions are most often, if not always, of a very particular type, i.e., those that put money in his pocket. Russia, as it turns out, is currently run by the very sort of people who conduct their affairs that way. And in their system, I guess they've legitimized that. That's not necessarily what the people of Russia want, but it's what the people who hold the levers of power want. And that's the kind of people who run Russia. They are, in Trump's view, what he would say in his words, my kind of people. That's why I want to be closer to them. Not because that means more money in my pockets, although wink, wink, that's actually what it means, and the intention of this whole thing here. But I'm more comfortable with people who are comfortable with saying, I don't want your agreement ideologically. I just want you to exercise power in favor of me, and I'll make it worth your while to do so. And interesting, I mean, if you want an ironic piece here, and you recall the old Soviet Bolshevik revolution, right? It was supposed to be a communist revolution, an international movement across borders, and regardless of, imperial designs across the multiple nations, that workers ought to unite. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Right now, it's oligarchs of the world unite. What if the peasants lose their chains and come after us? Or actually, who cares any of that? Why don't we just enjoy being oligarchs and having fabulous wealth together? And we can better protect that if we join together internationally to do that. So it's ironic in the sense that the Russians are involved here. Right? This is now and Trump is signing on to a transnational class-based alliance, except the class isn't the proletariat, it's billionaires and oligarchs. So that's rather disturbing, right? So there is the kind of alternative explanation that John Roberts would say means that you can't look any further at the motivations. Yes, you might have evidence of his taking bribes, but the point is that this decision could have been arrived at for ideological reasons, even though Trump is the least ideological person ever, and it's all transactions with him, and that's all there is to it. But yes, it's an incredibly dangerous combination, and harkens back to the things we've been repeating on the show for a long time, half jokingly, right? The idea of political union with Russia to own the globalists. Yes, they love this as a transnational movement. That's why they're so anxious to ally in the American conservative movement with not only with Russia. Russia is our friend, but also Viktor Orban in Hungary. And we're going to have CPAC conferences in Hungary. They're joining the other side here. And they're doing it openly, and they're doing it for Trump's pecuniary reasons. And he's convinced them all that actually it's just better ideologically for all of you. You're not getting the money, but ideologically you would be fine with being on the other side. And I don't know what to say about the historical antecedents to all this, but for some reason it's not a surprise with Trump, but it would be shocking with maybe anyone else, maybe even other Republicans. Not anymore, I guess, because they're all cashing in their values and signing on with Trump. And there's lots of writing about that. And I think a focus on a current piece, and for months now, years really, about J.D. Vance and how he's thrown all principle out in order to sign on to the Trump agenda. But maybe you all want to do the same thing. I don't know. But imagine at least a Democrat doing something like it. And the only, there's no analogy. Except to say, well, something I sent out via social media yesterday. Imagine had FDR's speech following Pearl Harbor, one of the most famous, oratory deliveries ever. But imagine the speech after Pearl Harbor instead saying, all right, we've been attacked by Japan, and this nation now should consider itself at war. joining Japan as an ally, maybe Nazi Germany as well. But imagine if the speech is all about joining Japan's side in the war despite the attack, right? And saying we're actually better off with them on our side and being on their side, and then finding out, and maybe he just admits it up front. It's not like we dig it out. We're joining the war. We're joining the war on Japan's side. And by the way, everyone should visit Tokyo as soon as possible and while you're there, stay at the Roosevelt Foundation's, the Roosevelt Organization's new glimmering hotel tower in Tokyo. And that has nothing to do with this. We just happen to be joining the war on the side of the people who bombed us, because they're telling us they'll keep bombing us unless we do this. And so we don't want to be bombed, right? Let's all just join the war on their side. Okay, well, that would probably be viewed with great suspicion here in the United States and shock and dismay. And yet, that's what's in the offing right now in this election that's coming up. And they say that the other guy should drop out. But at least the New York Times has come around. That's a good thing to read for the weekend. I will look forward to seeing you again on Monday and discussing it further. This is our last live Friday on the air for a little while, as by next Friday I'll be on my way out the door for a brief vacation and away again the following Friday. And I'll see what I can prepare for you for the week following next. But I'll be back Monday through Thursday of next week. I'll see you then.
RetoricRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Now, I'm told that the live stream starts to fade out at this point, and maybe you're not even hearing what I'm saying to you, but what I'm telling you is this. You should be staying tuned for Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy coming up next right here on Netroots Radio, his usual collection of eclectic selections from around the country and around the world. We'll see you next week.